Well, they are basically back to power in a sense because he was a senator, his sister is a senator, their mother was a member of the House of Representatives, and they practically control Ilocos Norte. So basically, it's not an issue of coming back to power. It's basically whether they're going to go to the highest post, which is basically the presidency, and go back to Malacanang. They will always have a grand plan, and any political family has a grand plan, except that now basically it's not necessarily a shoe-in for him because the dynamics of the elections this in 2022 might be very different. There might be dark horses coming out. And besides, the positioning of the mark of Bongbong vis-a-vis the Duterte is very important. The Dutertes and the Marcoses could not afford to run against each other. Okay, if they want, maybe that's if you want to stop the Marcoses, then probably we can pray or should pray that the Dutertes and the Marcoses will slug it out because they will take away votes from each other. And here, but what is interesting here is that if Duterte insists on running as vice president and Sara will run for president, then it will be very difficult for Dutertes to win. Basically, the Duterte needs the Marcoses more than the Marcos needs the Duterte because, I happen to be the chief political analyst of a survey firm right now. We're just crunching the numbers. In fact, we're going to release our results on Wednesday, but already have the results now with me. As we speak, I am dealing with the tables right now. And what is interesting is that the Marcos loyalists might be in the minority, but I would say they're a strident minority. They're an enduring one. They can swing. They're the swing vote. They could make or break a political career. More so that our elections is very, very pluralist. We have this system where there's so many candidates. It's not a two-party system. So it's very easy to mess around the dynamics of a vote if you control a sizable majority, plurality of maybe 16 million, 15 million. Then you can create trouble. So the Dutertes cannot afford to piss off the Marcoses. Because if you piss off the Marcoses, then the loyalists will follow him. So that might spell the doom of any Duterte to become president. But a Duterte running could also minimize the chances of a Marcos. So they need each other. So I don't know. Maybe what I'm actually looking at is that perhaps it could be a Marcos-Duterte tandem.
So for one to succeed, they have to
work together.
They have to work together. Otherwise, they could cancel each other out.
They could minimize. And of course, if you that's why the thing is, if the political opposition wants to stop the Marcoses or the Dutertes, then the prayer should be that both of them should run, or the opposition should minimize at least as much as possible the number of candidates that will run in the opposition, or the so-called at least if not an opposition, but someone who would be running against them.
Okay.
Otherwise, pag maglabo-labo yan, interesting. It's going to be an interesting time in 2022.
Okay, Professor Uruguay, but there's also this perspective that the more, not exactly the merrier, but more chances for particular candidates to make it. In this particular scenario in 2022, do you think that the scenario could be actually favorable for the Marcoses, not just for the other candidates? Because again, you just need a sizable plurality, not majority, as we have seen over the past electoral cycles. Hindi mo naman kailangan talaga ng majority.
Right. That is correct. Now, there were previous elections in our history wherein you only need a small plurality, not even a majority. And I think in terms of voter base, the voter base of the Marcoses have continuously delivered for them. No? They have a stronghold, a bailiwick that they have that almost becomes like their part of their machinery. But a national office is quite different. And as what Dr. Contreras said, the Marcoses cannot win by themselves. They will have to rely on their allies. And let us remember that for me, the original plan was really for Bongbong Marcos to have become vice president. And therefore, the grand plan, it would have been a bit smoother if he would be the anointed successor of the outgoing President Duterte. Perhaps there wouldn't be any uncertainty if Bongbong Marcos would have won the vice presidency. But all plans are even the best of plans do not push through. And I do see the vulnerability of the Marcoses as well, and therefore they cannot win the presidency, the top post, by themselves as well.
Can this upcoming presidential election be considered now or never for the Marcoses, or in particular for Bongbong Marcos? He's not getting any younger, and perhaps there are other factors that might come into play.
That is true, but the current president is in his late 70s. So, and it seems like Bongbong Marcos has some longevity that somehow mirrors even the longevity of his father, at least until the early 80s. But I do think that the Marcoses continuously reproduce the dynasty that they have built for many decades, and that doesn't mean that the loss of one may mean the end. And this really means that there has to be a way to prevent this family that has not reckoned with the past, with the history of the country, from reaching the halls of power. They will have to face the music, and maybe if they assume some of the accountability, then a conversation can start. But without that, without truth and justice, I don't think that a lot of people in Philippine society can move on and reconcile with what the Marcos regime has done in the past.
Okay, I'd like to take off from that last portion of Professor Arugay's statement. Professor Judy, why do you think that is the case for the Marcoses, despite this refusal to take accountability for the things that happened under the dictatorship? They remain pretty much very prominent. They have a stronghold in terms of certain geographical locations, in particular, diba, Ilocos Norte, that region. Parang, how do you explain that, despite EDSA, despite efforts coming from groups like yours to actually supposedly enlighten the public, but they're very, very strong. Nandyan pa rin sila, sturdy perhaps.
Well, we all know, Christian, that the People Power Revolution or Uprising 1986 ousted the dictator Marcos, but didn't bring about really major radical transformation in social and political relations. One elite was replaced by another elite. The same unequal relations remain, and that included the non-pursuant of justice against the Marcoses and their henchmen. That's why they can come back. That's why a lot of the money they have plundered remains with them. That's why they have returned to power. That's why our history books remain silent or forget what had happened during the martial law. So you have that kind of system that would allow them to come in. But again, when we talk about the next election, it's a question of survival for the Marcoses. I am talking about the survival of our country. Because, it's not just a question of the Marcoses coming to power, but it's a question of the continuation of the kind of regime that we have. We're talking Duterte-Marcos tandem, which Professor Contreras is saying, can our country survive another 6 years of an administration that we have suffered through the past 5 years? I don't think so. So the 2022 election is a matter of life for our country, not for Marcos. Which, let's go beyond that. No, another Duterte, another Marcos tandem will mean really the death of democracy in our country, and it will be so ironic because it will be the golden year of the dictatorship, of the plunder, the golden year of the Marcos dictatorship.
But how do you respond to this? To those who are saying that the son should be given a chance? He's not exactly like his father. There are those who are supporting the Marcoses, who are pushing for that particular proposition. And even those who are very open-minded. Well, that was in the past. Forgive and forget. Let's try this one, the son.
I think Professor Arugay explained it, that There has been no atonement. There has been no accountability. They have refused to surrender the money that they have taken from the Filipino people. It had to be taken from them. The paintings in New York, the deposits in the Swiss bank, it was not voluntarily given. And they have been, Imelda Marcos has been convicted twice, but remains free. So we're not talking of how I was making my calculation. When the Marcoses started in Malacanang 1965, he was only 8 years old. When they left Malacanang, he was 29 years old. He was not this little kid, innocent about what was happening. We have seen the video of them having that party in the yacht. We have seen the photo of him, in high hat and posing against a limousine. So they really had it, The Marcoses had their golden years during the martial law. And he was complicit, Christian. He was complicit.
Okay. Professor Contreras, this enduring loyalty to the Marcoses, how do you explain this? Despite what history has been teaching us, despite the testimonies, direct testimonies of those who actually suffered during martial law, why do you still have this sizable group of loyalists?
But Christian, as a social scientist and as a political scientist, I think maybe Professor Arugay can also attest to this. That is one of the understudied areas in our political history. Actually, there's so much scholarship on looking at the negative side of Marcos, but in terms of the side where how come he's enduring, how come the loyalty is there, I think there is a need to study that more systematically, because the fact that it has endured for several years, the fact that despite the horror stories that we're getting, and despite the affirmation of their crimes against the people, you still have that enduring loyalty. And I think the way to defeat the Marcoses, if you want to defeat them, this election, is not to speak so much against them, but to campaign for someone who might have the chance of defeating them. The anti-Marcos sloganeering has not really worked that much. Okay? And so perhaps what should be done, because it can only also backfire, in a way, because you have this loyalist group that can easily also troll you back. And, I think what the opposition needs to do is to change tactics and really work hard so that those are going to battle out with the Duterte-Marcos alliance can have a good chance. And they would not be able to do that if there will be many candidates. Right now, for example, I'm kind of amused because when Isko Moreno declared his candidacy, then the Dilawan loyalists pounced on him. It's as if and the same thing happened with Pacquiao. Maybe it's basically because politics is mathematics. You want to eliminate the chances of someone, that's going to run against you. But I think we should be more strategic in this. The political opposition should think of this as a form of a Game of Thrones, a form of alliances. It's like playing chess. You have to have a strategy. There has to be a new strategy. And I think what is happening right now, and one thing that we are looking at the result of our survey, it's interesting because the Philippine electorate is a mixed bag. You can see people who are against pro-death penalty, anti-terrorism law. You see that in the majority. But at the same time, they're also for human rights, for media freedom. You will be surprised at the result of our survey, a majority saying that communists must be allowed to compete in elections, even if they are for the anti-terrorism law. Now, socially, in terms of social policy, people are against the legalization of abortion, against the legalization of same-sex marriage, but they are for divorce. So what I'm saying here is that you have a very complicated political landscape. You have a very complicated electorate. But one thing is certain. Extremes and polar opposites may no longer necessarily work.
Okay.
There has to be in the middle ground, someone who can strike a balance between the conservatism and the liberal aspect of the Filipino political culture. And that is something that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, if we're going to again go back to this negative campaigning against the Marcoses or the Dutertes, it will just galvanize the majority, that loyal base. It will just make them even more angry, even more insistent. And so even and of course we know that politics is basically addition. Okay, you need to woo people who are no longer happy with the current administration.
Okay.
But if you're not going to, and you can only do that by convincing them that the other side is better, not that the current side is bad. You know, that may not necessarily be enough for you to win them.
Which I think we also saw in 2019 when it came to the strategy by Otto Derecho. I think you were partly referring to that now. Instead of talking more about what they plan to do, they also attack heavily the current administration.
Because people are needing some solution because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic will figure out very much in this election. You could no longer, the time has changed. You could just talk and talk and talk. People will be asking you, what are you going to do about our economy? Because what's happening right now is no longer a fictitious, hypothetical situation. We are in a crisis.
Okay. Professor Arugay, they agree. Basically, according to Professor Contreras, the anti-Marcos sloganeering has not been effective, basically. They agree. Number two, what else are those anti-Marcos forces doing wrong?
Well, I think it's not a matter of mutual exclusivity, meaning it's either one or the other. I do think there should be complementarity to approaches. So what Dr. Contreras said of approaching moderation, approaching the middle, and making sure that the candidates running for 2022, particularly those who will run against the administration and their allies, would appeal on the moderate side of the electorate. I mean, that has been the tried and tested formula. But for me, I think being moderate also should not prevent speaking to the base, speaking to the constituency that has been fighting for accountability, for truth and justice. So I think both could apply, and one should not just surrender the other one in the interest of pragmatism. But I do want to note that I think the electorate, and we can also see this from the one theory on the popularity of the Duterte administration, is the so-called fear factor. And I think that is also present. And I think that could be used because since EDSA of 86, I think our democracy is at its lowest. And this will matter in the elections. This means that if you are going to have a Marcos presidency, then as what Professor Tagliwalo said, you're basically putting the last nail in the coffin of Philippine democracy. So the mere fact that we have elections in 2022 that will be democratically held is the best proof that martial law and populist authoritarian leaders have no place in Philippine democracy, because we get to enjoy that right to suffrage, that freedom to choose our leaders. And without that democracy, then our elections will be a sham, just like during the martial law regime. So I think the elections are not only a referendum on who should lead, it's a referendum on whether this democracy that we have taken care of since 1986 will survive and thrive. And I don't think that is in the best interest of the administration candidates and even the Marcoses.
Okay, before we take a break, I think Professor Judy was raising her hand earlier.
Yeah.
You wanted to say something?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Well, when Professor Contreras says that, why are we harping on the negative aspect of the Marcoses? Because it's true. And you need to do that to expose it. And the moderate part, remember 2016? It wasn't, Duterte wasn't the most moderate candidate at all. He kept on attacking the previous administration, and he won on that basis, the ability to expose your opponent. I think it goes beyond that kind of moderation. What is important for us The Marcoses are running now. I think that's the major subject. And why do they still have loyalists, Professor Contreras? It's not just a question of we are not effective. You know, karma is not effective. The opposition. They have been working hard on this also. They have the largest, they have the patronage, and they have used social media, their celebrity status, to really distort the truth. So it's not just a question of, you know, we're too rabid, we're too noisy. And remember, those of us who have worked against the Marcoses have also done a lot in terms of addressing the issues of the pandemic, the issues of the economic crisis, the issues of corruption. So it's not like Professor Ari said, it's not either or. We have to expose the sins of the Marcoses and the continuation of the Duterte regime. At the same time, we present alternatives. And I think that is an important aspect.
Before we take a break, I singit pa lang kasi this is related eh. Can this also be ascribed to forgetfulness on the part of Filipinos? Because not just the Marcoses, Erap himself was convicted of plunder. He almost won in 2010. Diba? Kung wala yung wave of support in favor of Benigno Aquino III at that time, he placed second. We would have had a second Erap Estrada administration. I mean, how do you explain that?
Well, election is a different game. I'm sorry. You know, go ahead, Dr.
But Christian, that is precisely my point. Of course, there is a value in trying to critique the government. I'm not saying that we should stifle the opposition and that we should silence these criticisms. But if we want to really win in an election, that may not be enough. And in fact, they might be, in some situations, in some segments of the electorate, it might be fatal. This is a zero-sum game. Basically, if you're going to want to increase your roster of voters, you need to reduce the voters of the other side, unless you are banking on the fact that, you know, the new voters will really weigh towards the political opposition, and that's not necessarily true from the numbers that we're getting. So I am here talking about these things because I am looking at the data, an empirical data, fresh from the surveys. I wish I could tell you, but it's still under embargo because we're going to release it only on Wednesday during a press conference. Okay. But there are interesting patterns that really go into the point. If the mission is really to make Marcos lose or Duterte lose, then it is not enough to just go and attack them. Okay. There are possibilities, the winning possibilities of combinations. One thing very quickly, Christian, that we did in the surveys, we are simulating combinations because we ask questions like, who is your second choice